average. In the simplest terms, we're talking about some of the world's poorest people. So why are they so vulnerable? What can the international community do to help them? And why are their voices so seldom heard? Well, with me, two very knowledgeable people with us. Matthew Wyatt, who's the Assistant President of the External Affairs Department at the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD as it's known, and Eve Crawley, who's an advisor to the Food and Agricultural Organisation on equity, economic and social development. Thank you both for joining us. Matthew, let me start with you first. How do we describe Indigenous people?
Well, there are many different ways, but the way I like to think of it is that they're people who have a very long history of association with the land on which they live, but who now find themselves in states where the majority of the people speak a different language or have very different cultural traditions, and therefore they are in a minority, and it's often a minority that's not heard.
And these are people, Eve, who are suffering extreme poverty.
Absolutely. It's a combination of different factors which create this situation of poverty. Part of it has to do with the denial, the failure to recognize their rights, their human rights, their rights as citizens even. Part of it has to do with the disappearance of their environments and a loss of their lands and traditional habitats. Part of it also has to do with changes in biodiversity, social and political marginalization, a distance from the way in which states run themselves. So there's a regular process of exclusion, of discrimination against these people, which put them way below the national averages in almost every country.
And when we've talked about Indigenous people in the past, Matthew, we're talking about people who live also in geographical isolation as well.
Absolutely, and they live on many of the most fragile and marginal lands, be it in mountainous areas, sometimes lowland islands where they're very vulnerable now to the effects of climate change, or deep in forests where again they're vulnerable to logging and to the effects of that. So yes, absolutely, they live in the most fragile places where it's most difficult to earn a living.
But why does it matter? Why do we need to protect Indigenous people? Cities and towns are growing, they're soaking up different populations all the time. Why do these people matter?
Well, I think these people matter for two reasons. One is a question of rights. Indigenous people have a right to live on their lands in the way that they want to live, and that indeed has been recognised by the September 2007 Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the United Nations Declaration. So there's a moral right that they have. But secondly, it's in all our interests that they should be able to continue to live in the way they have. They've proved themselves over generations to be sound stewards of the lands on which they live. They protect biodiversity, and I think going forward, as we're looking for ways to reduce the effects of climate change, they can also be extremely helpful in terms of maintaining forests and storing carbon, and therefore helping to slow the climate change that they, of course, have had no responsibility whatsoever for bringing about.
I think we can see some pictures. These are the Yao people in China, one of the ethnic groups recognised by the Chinese government. They live predominantly in the southwest regions of China, fairly mountainous, isolated terrain. And this is a group that can trace its history back 2,000 years, so quite a unique set of people.
Absolutely, yes. And we've been very proud at IFAD, the organisation for which I work. We've been working with many of these people now for some years, helping them to use new techniques, but still in keeping with their old traditions, to find new ways of raising their animals, to find new ways of farming so that they can access markets, which of course are developing, so that they are then able to make a better living. And we've had some excellent results, and through this programme, tens of thousands of people in this area have managed to secure their incomes, and also through that be able to secure their rights as well.
Let's look at some more pictures here. This is the Hmong people who live in Laos, and this is a group that have had quite a painful history, Matthew. This is a group that backed the wrong side in the Vietnam War. Some of them turned Christian, some of them, of course, were rejected by communist rulers. And it's groups like this that have enormous problems now finding a way in their own society.
Well, that's right. There are many groups for various reasons that have these problems that you're talking about in society. And that is, I think, why this Universal Declaration that was made, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, is so important, because what it does is it establishes some very fundamental rights for Indigenous people. The right, it's a bit technical, but to prior informed consent before developments are done on their land, for example, is extremely important. So by setting
and that can
out...
be challenged in law, can it?
Well, in many countries it can, yes, absolutely. Essentially, this declaration is a political declaration, but many of the various chapters within the declaration are already challengeable in law. But the problem many Indigenous people face is that while in theory they may be able to seek redress in the law, in practice it's often very difficult because of the discrimination and so on. So the political signal that the declaration gives is extremely important in helping to make a reality of rights that may already exist in law but are not actually being realised at the moment.
What about women? What does this change for women?
Well, the declaration itself makes some very special provisions for women. It states that special attention should be given to women's issues, to women's rights, and to protection of women's concerns. It also has special provisions for children and for elders. The reason why this is important is because Indigenous women face a double discrimination. First of all, because they're Indigenous, and secondly, because they're women. So even in societies in which there has been traditionally a fairly good complementarity between male and female roles, one finds that with market changes, with development programs, there's often a tendency to favor men a bit more than women. And women then have more difficulty in exercising choice over agricultural technologies, over the crops that they maintain, to be able to secure the land that they need in order to feed their families or maintain diversity of crops within their locale. So there's a special need to pay attention to women.
And Eve, with regards to these Millennium Development Goals, let's just look at some of them. We've got halving extreme poverty, halting the spread of HIV/AIDS, providing universal primary education. Fine across the expanse of China and India and all these countries, but what about within Indigenous communities? Is it changing for them?
Unfortunately, the record for Indigenous communities is much lower, disproportionately lower. In the Asia region as a whole, one sees progress on some goals and less progress on others. So for halving poverty, for the goal of universal education at the primary school level, reducing gender disparities and access to education, those are doing well. But for basic sanitation, for reduction in infant mortality and the disease side, the progress is much less. For Indigenous peoples, it's worse. One also sees a very clear disparity between progress in urban areas and rural areas. And since so many of the Indigenous peoples do live in rural areas in Asia, that is correlated as well. So the progress has been very mixed. And I think one thing we have to remember is that the very idea of the Millennium Development Goals is, for many Indigenous peoples, a somewhat foreign idea. For them, the ideas of well-being are much more complex. They're connected with culture, with language, with spirituality. For them, land isn't just a productive resource. Land is the place where their ancestors live. It is the abode of their spirits. It is their past, their present, and their future. One Indigenous people representative told me, "The trees are our brothers and sisters. We are of the same genealogical branch. When you understand this, you understand what deforestation means to our well-being." And I think that there are very few cases that describe quite as well the complexity of this relationship, this bond between people and their land, that goals, abstract goals, have difficulty in addressing. So one of our challenges is to come up with indicators that can help to make the Millennium Development Goals real, but are also meaningful for Indigenous peoples themselves, and that allow us to monitor the progress of our programs and the progress of countries in addressing the concerns of Indigenous peoples.
Can I just add to that? I think that Eve is absolutely right, that the whole issue comes down to the fact that what we're not talking about is handing out goodies. What we're talking about is enabling people to exercise the rights that they have now in international law to manage their own lands and to control what happens on their own lands themselves. And that sounds pretty fair enough to me.
Much to do, many unique challenges. Thank you both very much indeed for your time. That's it from this special edition of Asia Today. I'm Christian Fraser in Rome. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.